your time today. As we do know, 4 months is an eternity in politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia.
Leland.
4 months is a long time in the fight against the coronavirus as well. The U.S. hitting another single-day record for new coronavirus cases. What Dr. Anthony Fauci says caused this spike and why he's warning it will get worse. Plus, top intelligence officials now briefing the Gang of 8 congressional leaders on reports of Russia paying bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan. Governor Mike Huckabee with how that could impact the 2020 elections.
And it's all BS. It's not. He wasn't briefed, and there was no consensus. As a matter of fact, the most reliable form of intelligence gathered around this episode was against Russia giving money to the Taliban.
Okay, everyone.
2 police officers in Missouri were injured overnight in separate shootings. A police officer and a bus driver were shot after a robbery at a bus stop. Both are expected to be okay. And in another incident, officers were called to a McDonald's in Kansas City where an armed man opened fire on them. He was killed when police returned fire. One officer was shot in the head and he's in critical condition.
New poll shows Joe Biden widening his lead nationally over President Trump. This is the Monmouth University poll that puts the former vice president ahead by 12 points. Biden's lead has steadily increased since March. With that, we bring in former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, Fox News contributor, joining us now. Good to see you, sir. As always, I just checked. We are 123 days to Election Day, which means about 196 news cycles till Election Day. Do these poll numbers even matter at this point?
Well, they matter only in showing maybe a snapshot and a trend, but it doesn't determine how the election's going to turn out because a lot of things can happen. Let's roll the clock back 4 months. We weren't, shut down with coronavirus then. So many things can happen. The president was way behind at this point in 2016. It looked like Hillary was going to cruise to victory, but there were many of us who said, no, she isn't. There is a mood in this country. I think that mood is beginning to reemerge. A lot of people are fed up with political correctness. They're disgusted with the nonsense like you were talking about earlier, to just get rid of the statue of Columbus and put up one of Chef Boyardee. People have lost their minds. And I think especially at 4th of July, we're celebrating America where people can go out and make nutty statements and make fools of themselves. If they tried this in most countries, they'd be shot or jailed for life. So, yeah, I think right now the president, has got some challenges, but I also believe that there's more than enough time for him to remind people that the worst thing they can do is elect Joe Biden, who is an AOC, Green New Deal, open border, raise your taxes, make the government bigger, shut your mouth if you're religious kind of guy. And if they want that, they can sure get it.
The line
I don't think they'll get it.
That's the line from the Trump campaign of a defined Joe Biden is the points you just made. This is what John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, had to say to the New York Times. People are making judgments talking about the president's poor poll numbers, about the president's performance there and how he's handling it. Sometimes you get dealt a hand and you got to play it. This brings up a point that you said about the president reminding people of why they supported him. Does he need to change what he is talking about and how he is reminding people and what issues he's running on?
It's not that he changes what he's saying. It's changing sometimes the manner in which he says it. And I don't mean that he becomes, the soft-spoken, genteel sort of guy that he never is going to be, because that's not his style. But it is making it about the slights that the country is feeling, not the ones that he is feeling. Quite frankly, most American voters and families and single moms out there and families trying to recover from coronavirus impact, they don't care that somebody has insulted the president. They don't care if somebody's lied about him. What they care about is whether they're going to recover and whether their neighborhoods are going to be safe, or will they be overrun by a bunch of protesters who break down their doors and steal their stuff. So that's where the president's got to focus. He's got to be the champion for the people, not the champion for his own problems that he faces because he's hated by the news media and hated by the far left.
The Atlantic described it as the president's best pitch is that real Americans are under threat and he's there to defend them. One issue that the president has gotten a lot of support on, in praise especially from his base on, is what he has done to rebuild the U.S. military and protect members of the military and his actions overseas, called into question a little bit by this reporting that the Russians were offering bounties for U.S. soldiers. The Gang of Eight up on Capitol Hill, those with the highest clearances, were briefed on the intelligence, and this is what two of the top Democrats had to say. Take a listen.
I'm not going to say anything about the briefing, but I believe that the president is not close to tough enough on Vladimir Putin.
The White House put on a con that if you don't have 100% consensus on intelligence, that it shouldn't rise to a certain level. Well, we would practically be investigating nothing if you had to start off at 100%.
Interesting that they don't actually talk about conclusive decisions in their comments.
Well, because there aren't any. That's why they can't do it. The fact is, this is a report that came from two very dubious sources. The New York Compost, or rather the Washington Compost, as I call them, and the New York Slimes. Both papers who hate President Trump, neither of whom have been able to verify it, and the leaders of the congressional inquiry, which they need to look into. If this is true, let's find out. But to say that he hasn't been tough on Putin is to totally deny the reality. He's been far tougher. He's been tough making NATO stronger by making those other countries pay their way. This is a president who has done what Barack Obama didn't do, what even George W. Bush didn't do, in terms of being tough on these not only weak European nations, but tough on Putin. He may say, oh, everything's fine between us, but I'll tell you, Putin does not want Donald Trump to be reelected.
Well, just ask the hundreds of Russian mercenaries that the U.S. military killed in Syria in terms of where American resolve lies. Governor, good to see you. You'll know when I say we're up against a hard break, we got to leave it there. Good to see you, sir.
Happy 4th.
You too. Alicia?
The Supreme Court blocking access to secret grand jury materials from Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. What this could mean for President Trump as he also battles congressional efforts to get his financial records. Plus, Jeffrey Epstein's longtime friend Ghislaine Maxwell arrested and charged with helping him recruit and sexually abuse underage girls. The next legal steps in this disturbing case.
Ghislaine Maxwell is a monster, and she's now in custody, and that's a very good thing. Miss Maxwell was the ringmaster. She was the architect of Jeffrey Epstein's sex ring.
Fox News alert as coronavirus numbers are spiking across the country ahead of the holiday weekend. The U.S. reporting more than 52,000 new infections yesterday. That surpasses the previous record for daily cases. President Trump is attributing the startling rise to increased testing, but Dr. Anthony Fauci is warning America needs to act fast before the outbreak gets worse.
What we've seen over the last several days is a spike in cases that are well beyond the worst spikes that we've seen. That is not good news. We've got to get that under control, or we risk an even greater outbreak in the United States.
Jonathan Seri, live in Atlanta, the home of the CDC, with more. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning to you, Leland. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is now mandating the use of face coverings. His executive order applies to all Texas counties that have at least 20 COVID-19 cases. In other words, nearly all of them. This week, the average daily number of new cases in Texas has quadrupled what it was in late May. Governor Abbott says he is issuing this executive order to avoid another shutdown.
Face covering is not the convenient thing to do, but I also know that wearing a face covering will help us to keep Texas open for business.
Former Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain is being treated for COVID-19 at an Atlanta area hospital less than 2 weeks after he attended a Trump rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. According to a statement released by his staff, there is no way of knowing for sure how or where Mr. Cain contracted the coronavirus, but we do know he is a fighter who has beaten stage 4 cancer. Vice President Mike Pence met with Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, which set a new state record with more than 10,000 new cases yesterday. Pence said half of the new cases involve people under the age of 35, who, of course, are at lower risk for complications. But he urged them to wear masks and social distance nonetheless.
No younger American would ever want to put at risk a grandmother, a grandfather, a mom, a dad, an elderly neighbor or friend by inadvertently exposing them to the coronavirus.
And Leland, the CDC has published a new study by local health officials in Pasadena, California. They looked at local nursing homes, infections there, and they found that more than 40% involved asymptomatic individuals. And so they say this means you need wide-scale testing, not just looking to identify symptoms. Back to you.
Our knowledge about the disease continues to evolve. Jonathan Serry in Atlanta. Jonathan, thank you. Alicia?
Certainly.
A big win for President Trump as the Supreme Court denies Congress immediate access to grand jury testimony from the Robert Mueller investigation. A federal appeals court ruled the documents should be turned over, but a decision by the High Court to hear the case will keep the material under wraps until after the election. Thomas Dupree is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and joins us now. Thank you so much for being here. My first question is, does this signal what might happen now with the president's fight against congressional Democrats over his financial records?
Well, I think it's certainly a good sign for the president as far as the Mueller documents go. And that, as you point out, what the Supreme Court said is that these records are not going to be seeing the light of day until 2021 at the earliest, and possibly never. Now, of course, on Monday, we're expecting decisions in all the cases involving the president's financial records. 3 cases, they're all consolidated. And from the questions and argument, it seemed as though the justices were aware of the fact that if you allow investigations to proceed against the sitting president, that it can tie him up, prevent him from doing his duties. But at the same time, they want to be accommodating to law enforcement if they can. So what we're going to be looking for on Monday is exactly how the Supreme Court decides to strike the balance between respecting the needs of law enforcement, respecting congressional oversight role, but at the same time, not preventing the president from carrying out his constitutional duties.
This is a big disappointment for Democrats, no doubt, and I want to put up a quote, a response from House Judiciary Committee Chair Jerry Nadler, Representative Jerry Nadler. He says, quote, "Unfortunately, President Trump and Attorney General Barr are continuing to try to run out the clock on any and all accountability. While I am confident their legal arguments will fail, it is now all the more important for the American people to hold the president accountable at the ballot box in November." My question to you is, do you think voters are paying such close attention to this, and this will actually matter to them in November? They have so many other things on their plate.
Well, that's the thing. At the time, certainly when the Mueller report hit, I think a lot of Americans were interested in this. But at this point, as you point out, there's a lot of other things going on in our nation right now. And look, the Supreme Court doesn't really care about the political timetable. I understand that the House Democrats wanted to get this material as soon as possible. They're hoping to use it in the 2020 campaign. But frankly, that's irrelevant to the Supreme Court. They're going to decide this case in the ordinary course. They're not going to issue a faster decision because that's what the House Democrats want. And I think what yesterday's ruling says is, look, we're going to decide this Mueller case on the merits, but we're not going to pay heed to the political calendar. We're going to follow our ordinary procedures and decide it in the fall.
And it's been a busy week. Late last night, the justices did block a lower court order out of a case in Alabama that would have essentially allowed more voters to use absentee voters in light of the pandemic. And so this is actually another disappointment for Democrats. And I'll put up a statement by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They say, unfortunately, this means that Alabama voters who are at greater risk of severe illness or death from COVID-19 will be required to risk their health and violate CDC recommendations in order to vote on July 14th. They're arguing there's a safety issue here. That's kind of the crux of the case here. But those against it say you have to have your ID. You have to present this in person. What do you think about this going forward, especially in light of the pandemic?
I think we're going to see a lot more of these types of lawsuits brought in the months ahead. The Supreme Court's order came out last night, and the court didn't provide any reasoning for why it basically stopped these changes to election law that a federal court in Alabama had ordered. But I suspect what's going on is that a majority of the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 vote, said that, look, this is changing the rules of the game by a